Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfix. Today I'll be starting a new fic entitled Fatigue Fractures, Baby I'm a Wreck. Summary. Izuku chases after Kacchan, staying right on his heels as they both sprint through the gate and into the mock city. Kacchan, Izuku calls out to his teammate. We need to make a plan for something. It's All Might, so maybe we should just run, because there's no way we can fight him. It's All Might. The hit to the face isn't a surprise, really. A part of Izuku was even expecting it, was waiting to feel that familiar burning crackle against his skin, the long familiar scent of burnt caramel flooding his senses, as pain ripples out across his face like a spiderweb, fractures in a foundation. What is a surprise is the way that something in his mind just shatters. Izuku grays out around the edges. Any trigger warnings for this fic are in the description below. Hope you guys enjoy this one. Chapter 1. Stomach clenching and bile rising in his throat, Izuku keeps his eyes on the screen as he fidgets. His hands twist themselves together and apart over and over again, nails digging into scar tissue to keep himself from picking at his nail beds until they bleed. He used to do that constantly growing up. His fingertips had been one massive throbbing ache for years on end, raw and hurting from ragged, bitten-down nails and ruthlessly peeled-back cuticles. The pain had been grounding, though, had helped him to keep aware and together through everything. That had been one of the things that people most knew about him in school when he was younger. He was quirkless first, before anything else. He was a creepy mumbler who always scribbled in his notebooks second, and he was the gross kid whose fingers were almost always either actively bleeding or wrapped up in bandages. It's a habit he'd only managed to break the year before, when having open wounds on his hand would have been equal to basically begging for an infection, since he'd spent most of his free time elbow-deep in trash at Dagobah Beach. It's a habit he's honestly considering taking back up right now, despite how much he knows any new kind of damage to his hands and arms, no matter how superficial, would overall be a bad idea. It's hard to bring himself to really care at the moment, though, because Izuku knows that he's going to fail this exam. Because once again, he's been paired with Kacchan. Only this time, instead of fighting one another, they're supposed to work as a team against a larger threat. And the larger threat that they're going up against is going to be All Might. There is, Izuku knows with a ragged sort of certainty, no way that he'll be passing this exercise. And if the sympathetic glances from Ida and Uraraka, as well as the displeased light in Todoroki's expression, is anything to go by, then he's not the only one who's already realized that. Izuku had learned a long time ago not to ask his teachers for anything. Tamakawa-sensei had taught him that in early elementary school, with long hours spent standing in the hall outside of his classroom, with the days where he'd been forced to balance dictionaries on his hands or to hold up a pail of water no matter how much his arms ached from the stress, all because he asked a question that Tamakawa-sensei had considered unnecessary, and any and every question Izuku had ever asked had always been deemed unnecessary. Izuku had learned real fast how to handle his own issues in class, how to research and teach himself anything he didn't understand. Every teacher he's had since then has only ever reinforced that lesson with sneers or extra cleaning duties that quickly became him taking over all cleaning duties, or whatever punishment they could think of to teach him the realities of life for someone like him. Aizawa-sensei, for all of his occasional harshness, has been the fairest teacher that Izuku's ever had. Being in the man's homeroom has been a pleasant sort of change for Izuku for the most part, as has most of his classes with the heroes teaching at UA, if he's being honest. But that doesn't mean that Izuku trusts the man. That doesn't mean that he really trusts any of them except for All Might. He knows they would protect him from villains, just like they'd protect the rest of his classmates. Aizawa and 13 both had almost died for his class at the USJ. Aizawa-sensei had especially, given the damage that had been dealt to him from both Shigaraki and the Nomu. Izuku has no doubts that any of the teachers would have done the same in their positions. The teachers at UA are heroes. It's who and what they are. So of course they'd stand between villains and their students, heroes in training or not. Of course they would. Of course Izuku trusts them with that. But on a personal level, when things like classwork and homework assignments and punishments are concerned, Izuku knows better than to expect much in those departments, knows better to expect much of anything, if he's being honest. But in this moment, against all of these well-known and long-learned odds, Izuku's also desperate. He doesn't want to fail. Not again. Not here. Not against All Might, who is counting on him for so much, and has already given him much more than anyone else in his entire life. So despite the way everything inside of him rebels at the very idea, despite the way he's already sure this won't work, Izuku still has to try. "Sensei," Izuku murmurs quietly as he slides up to Aizawa's side, arms crossed over his chest and hands twitching in the fabric of his costume, to try and still the urge to bite. "Problem, child." Aizawa stares down at him, one brow arched in question, but otherwise face is blank. I know it's really late and really selfish, and that there's a point to these matchups for you putting me and..." Izuku swallows roughly, words coming out in a mix of stuttering and half-finished sentences as he tries not to shake. "I know teamwork is important, but could... Izuku trails off, his mouth and throat working, but his voice gets trapped somewhere he can't quite reach it. "Kid." Aizawa sighs just a bit, obviously exasperated, and Izuku has to bite back his instinctive flinch. "What's this about?" Izuku pauses, swallows again, and gathers as much determination and grit as he can get a mental hand on. "Can you please give Kacchan a different partner?" Izuku asks, and he manages to finally get the question out. We can't work together, not for this exam." There's a long moment of silence. When Izuku finally managed to look up again, he can't help but blanch just a bit at the disappointment that's so blatantly plain in Aizawa-sensei's expression then. "I've got half a mind to fail you right there," Aizawa tells him. Voice that dangerous is soft as it gets when someone makes a mistake that he absolutely can't abide by. Izuku hates being on the receiving end of it. "You said you know teamwork is important, right, Midoriya?" Aizawa keeps going, something almost frustrated lurking in the corners of his mouth. "You're going to have to work with all kinds of heroes if you make it pro, no matter what your personal relationship is with them. So this rivalry between you and Bakugo, you need to work on it with or around it, because if you don't, then you fail this exam. I might have to reevaluate your potential, and it might not just be the summer camp you end up missing." Izuku doesn't say anything else. Instead, he just turns to face to the side and folds down in on himself a bit more, bobs his head in a shallow, nodding bow, and slinks away back towards where Todoroki has been watching him. His friend doesn't say anything to him, just brushes their shoulders together, in a move so subtle Izuku doesn't feel it, given how deep into his own head he's managed to sink. He should have just kept his mouth shut. Asking a teacher for help had, once again, done nothing but make things worse, just like it always has for him. Izuku chases after Kacchan, stays right on his heels as they both sprint through the gate and into the mock city. "Kacchan," Izuku calls out to his teammate, we need to make a plan or something. It's All Might, so maybe we should just run, 'cause there's no way we can fight him. It's All Might." The hit to the face isn't a surprise, really. A part of Izuku was even expecting it. Was waiting to feel that familiar burn of crackle against his skin, the long familiar scent of burnt caramel flooding his senses as pain ripples out across his face like spiderweb fractures in a foundation. What is a surprise is the way that something in his mind just shatters. Izuku grays out around the edges. Something inside of him takes a step back and to the left until he's almost standing outside of his own body and watching the world pass by around him. It's a feeling Izuku hasn't had in a long time now, but it's still one he knows. Izuku doesn't remember the rest of the exam. It's only aware of it in a vague sort of way. As his body moves and fights and runs and hurts all without his real consent or input. Izuku gets up. He runs. There's wind and fire, there's fists and feet and screaming. The pop, crackle, pop of explosions. He gets back up, pushes himself up and away from metal and concrete and shattered glass. He keeps running. There's something he's always known how to do. Pop. Coward. Coward. Crackle. Useless fucking coward. All you ever do is run. Pop. Stand still. Take it. They win. Somehow, despite everything and against all odds, they win. They win, but Kacchan is still so angry, is still so pissed and vicious about something Izuku's done or not done, or maybe just as Izuku is existing in his general vicinity. Izuku isn't really sure which it is. All of the above, more than likely. Izuku just lets him scream, lets him threaten and curse him, lets him pop off his quirk in his face like he's been doing since they were 4, and Izuku stopped being a real person in Kacchan's eyes. Izuku just stands there and takes it, even after they're back in the viewing room with the others, and Kacchan still hasn't calmed all the way down. Izuku gives him a shallow nod. All Might says something that, for once, Izuku doesn't actually pay attention to. Uraraka and Ida smile and talk. Todoroki stands at his side, a silent but steady presence. Izuku just drifts. Later, once they've all filed back onto the bus and ridden back to the main campus, Izuku still finds himself covered in that familiar gray haze. Still finds himself standing just beside his own body and watching everything pass him by. In the end, Izuku sits there on the bus, cheek, back, head, and heart all aching for the longest time. He stays there long after everyone else had already cleared out, except for him and Todoroki, who had waved Ida and Uraraka away, and then stayed sitting silently in the seat beside him. Izuku sits and exists and doesn't do much else but those two things. Todoroki drifts out of the bus somewhere around the 2-hour mark with one last lingering look at Izuku. But still, Izuku just stays. Sunset comes. The bus is awash in fiery reds and oranges that make Izuku uncomfortable for some reason that he can't exactly place. Body aching in a way that he almost registers, head stuffed full of cotton and vision gray around the edges. Izuku finally gets up. He leaves. Not all of him walks away. Izuku's been a patchwork person for as long as he can remember. Fractures and scars sewed together with tears and apologies, held together by a thin thread of hope and built on a shaky base of, please, I just want to be a hero. I just want to help. Let me help, please. But all threads fray eventually. All bases under heavy stress will break down. Fatigue fractures spreading outwards like spider webs. Recovery Girl scolds him again, tells him she's only going to heal him up after his normal, ridiculous recklessness because the burn and the fractures in his cheek and the jaw would make it difficult for him to eat, because the dislocated shoulder can't be left alone. The bruises will have to heal naturally because she swears, yet again, that she won't keep doing this, won't enable him and his reckless self-destructive tendencies. Izuku just nods, shrugs, and walks away. School nurses have never liked Izuku much, have always gotten exasperated with his injuries, and tired of seeing him after a few weeks into each new school year. To her credit, Recovery Girl had lasted longer than most. It doesn't matter either way. Izuku got used to patching himself up a long time ago. The few months he's had at UA haven't erased all of his hard-won and long-perfected first aid skills. He can save Recovery Girl's remaining scraps of goodwill for anything too extensive for him to handle on his own. Either way, he'll get by, like he always has. Life becomes a collection of actions for Izuku in the days after the exam. Becomes a series of tasks instead of experiences. It goes from the routine he'd slowly, cautiously, hopefully settled into back into the almost rhythmic sort of flow that used to be all that got him through his day-to-day life growing up. It becomes wake up, train, eat, go to class, smile, nod, train, hurt, sit, stand, smile, train, sleep. Wake up gasping alone in his room, chest heaving and throat sore from nightmares, memories he can't, won't remember. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Izuku exists. He doesn't do much else. Sometimes, in his clearer, more present moments, Izuku thinks about his last year of elementary school, or, to be more accurate, he thinks about the fact that he doesn't really remember most of it. He's got the scars to prove that it happened, but he'd existed then too, instead of living. Izuku had hoped, had dreamed that UA would be different, that the school full of heroes and hero hopefuls and the best and the brightest Japan had to offer would be better. And for a while it had been. and in some ways it still is, but Izuku should have known better than to get his hopes up too high. Good things rarely last, and some things never change. A thought that Izuku would have never dreamed he'd have begins to take shape in the back of his mind, and despite the way it feels, it's almost like it's blasphemy, Izuku can't shake it off completely. Todoroki stops him one day in the locker room after training, keeps him behind as the others get dressed and head off towards the dorms and dinner. "I don't know how to help you." Todoroki's voice is calm and even, but Izuku sees what looks like a lot of worry in his mismatched eyes. "Not like you helped me." "I'm fine," Izuku tells him absently, the same reassurance he's been saying since he was 4, 5, 8, 13 years old. The same thing he's always told his mom, the same thing he'd told Uraraka and Ida only the day before. "You're not," Todoroki disagrees. "The others might not see it, but I can. That look in your eyes." There's an understanding in Todoroki's voice, in the line of his shoulders, a knowing in the set of his mouth. "The world's really gray, isn't it, Todoroki-kun?" Izuku asks almost absently as he reaches down to pick up his uniform shirt. A cool hand stops him as fingertips trace over the collection of starbursts that litter the slope of his shoulder, spilling down and over his collarbone. "Mine used to be," Todoroki murmurs after a long, quiet moment. "How'd you fix it?" Izuku asks the question softly, aware but not, mind still halfway floating somewhere static and dull. "I didn't," Todoroki tells him just as softly. Izuku's been running for so long now. He doesn't want to run anymore. Doesn't want to leave some of the things he's finally found behind. And yet, no one's expecting the way Todoroki lashes out that evening. The class is gathered in the dorm's common room, dinner cooking in the kitchen and laughter heavy in the air. Izuku sits curled up in the corner where Todoroki had put him earlier, notebook in hand and eyes trained out the window, with Todoroki himself a warm line of solidarity at his side. Ida and Uraraka are settled on the love seat close to them, Tsuyu at Uraraka's feet while she braids her hair, and Ida watches with his special brand of intensity. Everything is quiet and calm for the most part, but then Kaminari's bray of laughter rings out across the room, and a familiar pop, crackle, pop cuts through the air. Izuku flinches. Todoroki's moving in the next moment. He flows up and off the couch from beside Izuku, and there's barely enough time to blink before the spikes of ice are surging across the common room. The attack sends Kacchan tumbling backwards from where he'd been hovering over Kaminari with a shout. He hits the ground and rolls back up onto his feet, with a snarl even as he surges forwards to attack. Todoroki, unfazed, meets him halfway. And this time, unlike at the sports festival, he does it with both his ice and his fire in hand. The window behind Kacchan shatters, and Izuku can only watch as he goes flying. Someone screams. Outside the dorm, Kacchan roars. Aizawa-sensei comes a moment later, hair raised, eyes burning, and utterly furious. Kacchan has to be full-body restrained. Todoroki just stands there, passively with a loop of Aizawa's capture scarf settled firmly around his waist. Everyone else is confused and upset, and a few even sound scared. Izuku just looks back at Todoroki, who's been staring at him the entire time with something that feels almost like awe brewing to life inside of him, flittering in through the static and the haze that he's been living in. Right before he's dragged out of the dorm by Aizawa, Izuku's sure he sees Todoroki smile. Todoroki gets an entire week of house arrest, a month of detention, and an official warning. He'll also be stuck with the remedial classes during the training camp. Whenever anyone, even the teachers, asks him why, he just shrugs and turns away. Izuku seems to be the only one who notices the way Todoroki always turns to look at him. It makes him feel just a bit more awake and aware. Makes him feel just a bit more real. Sometimes, when the dorm room is quiet and dark and his body feels real again, for at least a little while, Izuku heads outside. He'll slip out of his dorm window, bare feet, so he can feel the coolness of the night dew on the grass, and he'll just walk the small courtyard garden behind the dorm. Back and forth, around and around, through the flowers and the small class vegetable plot that Ida and Yaomomo had gotten permission for them to make. Izuku waits, sort of absently and without really caring, to get in trouble for his nighttime activities, but no one ever calls him on it. He never gets reprimanded for breaking curfew or anything like that. No one says anything. So either Nezu, who Izuku thinks is probably someone who knows, is content to leave him be, or he's been wrong about the level of surveillance the dorms are actually under all this time, and no one actually knows about his walks. Both options are worthy of deeper thought, but either way Izuku doesn't stop sneaking out. Sometimes Todoroki even comes out onto his balcony despite how late it is. Even when he's on house arrest, he'll still come out and sit on the railing of his balcony, like a silent sort of reassurance. Sometimes Izuku will hop up to sit on the railing beside him, their shoulders pressed together and hands just brushing. "If I didn't go to UA anymore," Izuku asks one night when the stars and his mind are both clear and bright, and everyone but the two of them have all long since gone to sleep. "If I went to a different school, would you still be my friend?" "I'd probably just transfer with you," Todoroki tells him simply, with a small, unconcerned shrug. Izuku goes still. "What?" Izuku whispers out the question, through a throat that's gone tight with emotion. "Shiketsu is a good school," Todoroki offers blandly. "It's prestigious in its own right, and they'd take you on a scholarship after your showing in the sports festival if All Might doesn't want to pay for your transfer himself." Izuku stares up at him, eyes wide and heart pounding. "We're going to be heroes no matter what, Izuku," Todoroki tells him like it's obvious, like it's a universal law, like the sound of his first name isn't enough to make something inside of Izuku shake. "UA isn't the only place to do that, and if you change schools, then I'd rather be there with you than here without you. Besides, even if Endeavor won't pay for tuition, if I transfer, then I'll apply for their scholarship too. They'd probably jump at the chance to steal the son of the number 2 hero from UA." Izuku absorbs all that, swallows as best as he can through the tightness in his throat. The sigh he gives out is shaky at best. "Yeah," Izuku murmurs, just a bit dazed as tears gather at the corner of his eyes. I'd rather be with you too, Shoto." His hand shakes as he slides it across the railing and tentatively touches his fingertips to the back of Shoto's. Shoto just shifts his hand until their fingers are tangled together. His warmth feels soothing against Izuku's scars, and for the first time in what feels like forever, Izuku breathes. Chapter 2, in which Izuku finds his resolve. Izuku resettles into his body in bits and pieces. Graying out, as Izuku always called this thing that happens to him, but because of some part of him that shies away from the proper name for what happens to him and from what it implies about him and his life, has always been equal parts exhausting and dreamlike. It's a strange state of being, living in half measures. It's draining, that long familiar feeling of being half aware and half drifting, somewhere just left of where he knows he should be, of being breathless and breathing, sleeping and awake, of being grayed out everywhere, and yet only around select edges all at the same time. Regaining his color, resettling into his body, has always hurt, has always left Izuku feeling raw and wounded, and ready to shake apart in the aftermath. But this time things aren't miraculously perfect, but they are different. This time, instead of snapping back harshly, painfully into place, as he always has in the past, Izuku resettles slowly, bit by bit. And tucked away in that carefully shielded part of himself that's always moving, always thinking, and calculating, and analyzing, Izuku knows that it's because Shoto helps. Having Shoto around, having him standing at his side or hovering just as his shoulder, or as he seems to be these days, it helps a lot more than Izuku had ever thought possible. Helps more than anything or anyone Izuku had ever known or thought of before. When they sit together at lunch, Shoto presses their knees together beneath the table, and suddenly Izuku can taste what he's eating again. Food becomes food again, instead of tasteless mush that he's obligated to consume to keep his body moving. When they're assigned paired classwork or during training blocks, Shoto partners up with him at every given opportunity. He moves so fast to claim the spot beside Izuku, and then dead-eyes anyone who gets too close. Eventually, the rest of the class stops asking altogether, seeming to accept that Izuku's been declared off limits. Either way, Shoto never falters and Izuku never protests. Instead, Shoto just pulls him to the side, and Izuku goes willingly, content to be led by someone he knows won't hurt him. Shoto presses the both of them into the corner of the classroom, or whatever training yard or gym they're currently using, tucks the both of them as far away from the others as possible. Instead of feeling crowded or isolated, Izuku finds that he can actually concentrate, can actually remember and experience things when it's Shoto working at his side, Shoto standing between him and everyone else. Shoto, quiet and calm but always there, gives Izuku room to breathe. For the first time in his life, Izuku has someone he doesn't have to emotionally or physically hide from, has someone he doesn't have to pretend for. For the first time since he stopped being a person and started being a thing to the world at large, Izuku has someone beside him who allows him to simply be. Someone that, somehow that acceptance makes everything so much smoother. Izuku knows it might just be proof that he's weak, that he needed to have Shoto with him in order to be again, knows he should be trying to do all this on his own, but all he really feels is protected. Izuku's never really been protected before, not like this, not from anything that wasn't certain death. Then even then it wasn't like this. Nothing in Izuku's life has ever felt like this. Shoto is unlike anyone Izuku's ever had in his life before. But just as Izuku has learned when he was 4, 5, 9, 14 years old, and standing on the edge of a building, good things never last. And despite all his years of experience, and no matter how much he might wish otherwise, Izuku can only run so fast. Eventually the things that are chasing him have a tendency to catch up. Hero schools don't operate on the standard school schedule, so even though they've had their final exams already, training in certain classes don't actually stop. Instead, things shift a bit more towards the physical end of the spectrum, with book classes being phased out until the next semester officially begins. More group and specialized training slots into their places as the time until training camp slowly clicks down. Izuku knows what's going to happen long before it does. It's easy to calculate the odds, to watch as the rest of the class is paired off and his options whittle down bit by bit. So by the time it happens, Izuku's not even close to surprised. Final matchup for the day will be young Midoriya and young Bakugo, All Might announces cheerfully, smile bright and hands resting on his hips. This time Izuku doesn't even bother to glance at Aizawa, who's leaning against the wall overseeing things. He doesn't bother to look at any of his classmates either. Instead, he just stares up at Shoto with something thin and aching stirring to life inside of him. He's been getting better, been settling, bit by bit, every single day, but now he's right back where he started, right back where he always seems to end up no matter the circumstances, facing off against Kacchan. Because it seems as if that's exactly where everything and everyone in his life but Shoto wants Izuku to be. And Izuku already knows that nothing he says to any of the teachers will be enough to get him out of it. "I can stop it," Shoto offers, his hand wrapping around Izuku's, seemingly uncaring that anyone could see the way that their fingers tangled together if they bothered to look. "Say the word and I'll break him." It's a kind offer, the kind of fierce protection and unwavering support that no one else had ever really extended to Izuku. Shoto is ready and willing to interfere with the class, to get in trouble yet again with even harsher consequences, is ready to fight, all to make sure that Izuku can walk away from this moment unscathed and avoid yet another brawl with Kacchan. "No," Izuku says softly, finger squeezing around Shoto's as he does his best to breathe. "It's okay." This isn't an exam where Izuku's future depends on him somehow working with Kacchan as a team. This is just training. It's just another class, just another fight, another battle, another familiar bit of pain and fear and exhaustion waiting to happen. Izuku's been doing this in one form or another for years. He can handle it. But the fact that Shoto offered, was willing to put himself in the line of fire from multiple directions all for Izuku? It means more than Izuku can say. Later, once it's done and training is over and everyone else has walked off laughing and groaning and happy with only a few scrapes and light bruises to show for the day, Shoto sits with Izuku now inside the quiet locker room. Izuku's body aches and exhaustion tugs at the edges of his senses, but he's present, Somehow, someway, he's still aware. But given the fact that Shoto hasn't left his side unless absolutely necessary, maybe it's not that much of a surprise. "You should see Recovery Girl," Shoto murmurs from beside him, a voice a deliberate soft of sort, and even. Izuku doesn't have to look up to know that Shoto's eyes are locked on the vicious bruises that are already blooming across Izuku's ribs. He can feel the weight of his gaze, can feel Shoto's eyes like a physical touch as they glance over his scarred shoulders, at the warped bits of skin on his upper arms, at the small burn brushing across the arc of his left cheek. Training or not, supervised by the teachers or not, Kacchan hadn't pulled any of his punches. And why would he, when restraint, especially against Izuku, has never been something high on his list of priorities? Needless to say, the temperature in the locker room had dropped just a bit as soon as Izuku had peeled off his seared and tattered jumpsuit and tossed it to the bench. "I can't," Izuku tells him just as quietly, because even if Shoto doesn't know, Izuku still remembers Recovery Girl's warnings. Bruised ribs and a few burns aren't enough to risk irritating her over. Better to save that for something bigger, something Izuku hasn't been dealing with his whole life. "Okay," Shoto agrees. He doesn't ask questions, doesn't press Izuku for whys or try to convince him, so Izuku doesn't say anything else on the matter, doesn't feel that urgent need to try to explain himself. Instead, Shoto just reaches over and lays a cold hand against Izuku's bruised ribs, delicate frost spiraling out across his fever-hot skin. The relief is instant, but it's the wordless acceptance that Shoto gives him that means more. So Izuku lets himself list just a bit to the side, lets himself sway just a bit further into Shoto's space, until his temple is resting against the taller boy's shoulder. And Shoto, quiet and solid and there, lets him. They sit together in silence for the longest time. "You always get hurt," Shoto says softly, just before they go their separate ways for the night. "Worse than any of us." Izuku doesn't know what to say to that, so he just stands there, his back pressed against his dorm room door as Shoto crowds closer to the front. "It's not so bad." Izuku knows it's not. He's had worse in the past. The final exam, for example, had been way worse. At least this time Izuku knows that nothing is actually broken or dislocated. "It is," Shoto presses. "You just can't see it like you should." There's a moment of silence. "I was serious," Shoto finally says, "about leaving, about Shiketsu, about all of it. I'll go with you. We can do this, Izuku. We can be heroes together. Somewhere else. Somewhere safer for you." Izuku's heart skips a beat. He's been doing his best to push that thought, that possible path, down and away since he'd started to really slot himself back into his body again. Has been trying to make himself believe that it was just a thought brought on by the stale grayness that had consumed him. It hasn't been working, but Izuku's kept trying. Shoto," Izuku whispers, just a bit lost and reeling like he always is every time he allows himself to really think about leaving UA. "How would you feel if it was Ida or Uraraka getting hurt all of the time? If it was me?" Shoto asks him, something steady and almost understanding in his expression. "How did you feel when you found out about Endeavor, and everything else? How do you think it feels for me to see you like this, over and over again, because no one else seems to see the problem?" Shoto leans down close enough to press their foreheads together, close enough that they're breathing each other's air. "We're not heroes yet, Izuku," Shoto tells him a bit raggedly, as he presses even further into Izuku's space somehow. "And even with the villain attacks, it's not supposed to be like this. UA was supposed to be different." There's a wealth of unspoken information in that statement, nuance and layers that they're both aware of but don't have to actually speak about in the moment. UA was supposed to be different for both of them in a lot of ways. And it has been, and yet, eyes slipping closed, Izuku basks in that closeness, in the serenity and steady sort of realness that comes hand in hand with being near Shoto. But all the while, his mind clicks away. Later, when Izuku was in his room, with the plastic tote that doubles as his first aid kit open on the bedside beside him, he finds himself grinding to a complete halt when Shoto's words echoing in his head again. What if it was Ida or Uraraka? What if it was me? Izuku remembers the fierce and protective rage he'd felt for Ida in that alley, remembers his determination to save Uraraka at the entrance exam, in part because it was the right thing to do, and because she'd been the first person in his age to even passingly be nice to him in so long. Remembers the emotions that had seared him so deep at the revelation of just what Shoto had had to deal with for so many years from someone who should have kept him safe on more than one level. The way not even his desire to make All Might proud had been strong enough to keep him from doing whatever he could to help. Izuku remembers the way he'd thrown himself into the line of fire for each of them, breaking his body into bits and pieces over and over to keep them safe, to help them out of their own personal darkness. He remembers how much it had hurt to see them in danger or in pain, just like it always hurt in some level every time someone in 1A ends up in a bad position. Burned cream in one hand and sterile gauze in the other, Izuku goes still as the truth spikes through him, sharp and merciless, and sounding just a bit too much like Shoto's voice in the back of his head. For a moment, Izuku just looks at the medical supplies that he's holding, looks at the tote that he's spent most of his allowances over the years on to get and keep stocked and hidden away from his mom. Izuku looks, and he thinks, and he imagines. For a too long moment, Izuku feels as if he can't breathe through the thick rush of, no, not them ever, not them, not again, it's not right. That claws its way to life inside of him. Izuku's head feels overfull, his heart feels shredded, and the tears that prickle his eyes both feel molten, hot, and blistering cold. But in that moment, Izuku finally thinks he understands exactly what Shoto's been trying to tell him. With the entirety of his focus bent in one direction, it only takes Izuku a few hours to get everything together for both Shoto and himself. Transfers between hero schools are unusual, but they do happen. The paperwork requirements and forms are out there and easily found, even if it's absolutely unheard of for someone to attempt to transfer out of UA. UA is, after all, the hero school of Japan. People who make it into UA tend to stay in UA, unless they have absolutely no other choice. Izuku had once thought he'd be no different. UA was All Might's alma mater, after all. It was the hero school in Japan, staffed with and attended by the best of the best, and it had been Izuku's dream for as long as he could remember. But Shoto was right, and Izuku is so tired. He doesn't want to do this anymore, doesn't want to stay stuck in the same holding pattern of fear and pain and helpless anxiety that he's been trapped in since he was 5 years old. Izuku wants to learn, wants to change and grow and finally be free to just be. And as much as it hurts and aches and burns, Izuku doesn't think that he can do any of that here. Not really. He can't do any of those things to the fullest extent possible, with Kacchan looming over him like a guillotine, hovering over the sidelines of his life like a bomb with a hair trigger. Whatever growth he'd achieved in the long run would be stunted. So Izuku doesn't want to just endure school and training another 2 years, doesn't want to study and train and fight during school hours only to have to go back to the dorms afterwards, to the safe place that will never really be safe for him. He doesn't want to be forced to live in the same building as someone ready to beat him down with fists and feet and searing explosions at the drop of a hat, at the barest hint of any real, imaginary slight. Something has to give, and, for the first time in his life, Izuku's not ashamed to admit that, this time, it's going to be him. "Hey," Izuku says softly as he steps up to Shoto's side, a thick folder tucked neatly beneath his arm and another held out in Shoto's direction. "Did some research last night, if you're still serious." Shoto takes the folder and flips it open to see what's inside. Izuku can tell the moment that he realizes just what he's looking at. Transfer papers, scholarship applications, permission slips, and a host of other forms that need to be filled out, if they're really going to do this. "Absolutely." Shoto agrees immediately, mouth turned up just a bit at the corners, as he closes the folder and reaches out to grab Izuku's hand in his free one. "Okay," Izuku nods, heart pounding but his resolve firm, as he twines his battered fingers with Shoto's. He is present, and aware, and real, and they are doing this. Let's get started. Let Kacchan keep UA just like he's always wanted. Izuku's found something more important. He's going to be a hero, side by side with Shoto, no matter what. This concludes part 1 of the series entitled Like Fractions, Baby We're Breaking Down. This series has 3 parts, and I really like it a lot, so I think I'm going to continue with the next part as well. As always, thank you all so much for listening.